Lisa Monroe stood at the observation window of the diplomatic vessel as it approached the Zephyrian homeworld. The stars around her seemed brighter here, more alive somehow, as if they possessed consciousness and intention. She had been chosen for this mission because she was calm under pressure, and because she had spent her entire career believing that understanding could bridge any gap between different peoples. What she did not know was that the Zephyrians were not interested in simple trade agreements or cultural exchanges. They were facing an existential threat that would either force them to become warriors or cease to exist entirely. The planet below was stunningly beautiful, covered in crystalline formations that caught and reflected the light of its twin suns. Violet clouds swirled across the atmosphere, and great towers of what looked like living crystal rose from the surface, glowing with soft internal light. Lisa had studied everything she could find about the Zephyrians in the weeks leading up to this mission. They were a species that had evolved on a world where violence was rare, where conflicts were resolved through art and philosophy and deep conversation. Their technology was far advanced beyond humanity's, but it was technology focused on creation and exploration, not destruction. The United Nations had believed this made them perfect trading partners. Lisa was beginning to realize that it made them vulnerable in ways they probably did not fully understand themselves. The landing was smooth and graceful. As she descended the ramp of her ship, Lisa found herself face to face with a welcoming committee of Zephyrian officials. Their silver skin seemed to shimmer in the alien sunlight, and their amber eyes studied her with what she recognized as a mixture of hope and desperate concern. An older Zephyrian male stepped forward, his skin bearing faint marks that suggested age and experience. He introduced himself as Minister Thorne and welcomed Lisa in perfect English, which surprised her until she realized that the Zephyrians had been monitoring human broadcasts for decades. They knew far more about Earth than Earth knew about them. Minister Thorne led her through the crystalline city, explaining the history and culture of his people as they walked through streets that seemed almost magical in their beauty. The Zephyrians had built their civilization around principles of harmony and balance. Their buildings were grown rather than constructed, cultivated from living crystal over generations. Their cities were designed to integrate seamlessly with nature, not to dominate or control it. Lisa found herself impressed by the sophistication of their approach to living in harmony with their environment. But as they walked, she began to notice things that troubled her. Defensive installations hidden among the crystal formations, armed warriors stationed at strategic points throughout the city, and an underlying tension in the way the Zephyrians moved and spoke, as if they were all carrying some great burden. When they reached the palace, Lisa was led to a chamber where a young woman was waiting. She was extraordinarily beautiful, with silver skin that seemed to flow like liquid mercury and amber eyes that held both infinite kindness and profound sorrow. She introduced herself as Princess Arya, the heir to the Zephyrian throne, and Lisa immediately understood that this meeting was far more important than any simple diplomatic exchange. Arya greeted Lisa with the formal hand gesture she had learned from human broadcasts, and when their hands touched, Lisa felt a strange sensation, almost like an electrical current mixed with warmth and something deeper that she could not quite name. Arya invited Lisa to walk with her in the palace gardens, away from the formal chambers and the watchful eyes of guards and advisors. As they walked among strange alien flowers that chimed softly in the breeze like bells, Arya began to tell her story. The princess explained that the Zephyrians had known about the Krillians for several years. The Krillians were an invasive species that consumed worlds, hollowing them out from within, stripping them of all resources and leaving nothing but dead stone behind. They were not creatures driven by hunger or need in the way biological beings understood it. They were machines, or something very close to machines, designed and built by some long-extinct civilization for a single purpose: to expand and consume and destroy. The Krillians had already destroyed 3 worlds and adjacent systems. The Zephyrian government had tried to maintain diplomatic relations, had attempted to reason with them, had offered resources and technology in hopes that peaceful coexistence might be possible. All of these efforts had ended in failure. The Krillians did not negotiate. They did not reason. They consumed. 5 years ago, the Krillians had arrived at Zenith Minor, the sister planet to Zenith Prime. The Zephyrians had watched helplessly as the invasion fleet descended. As the massive machines began the process of stripping the world bare, millions of Zephyrians had lived on Zenith Minor, and the Zephyrian government had attempted an evacuation. But there had not been time to save everyone. More than 2 million Zephyrians had died in the initial bombardment alone. The survivors who had made it to Zenith Prime carried with them the memory of the screaming and the destruction, and the complete helplessness of watching their world die. Now the Krillians were coming for Zenith Prime. The scouts had detected their fleet moving through space toward their world. It was only a matter of time, perhaps weeks, before the invasion began in earnest. The Zephyrian military had been preparing as best they could, but they were not warriors. Their weapons were designed for defense, for planetary shields and basic protective systems. Against an enemy that could attack from orbit, that could rain down destruction from above, their defensive capabilities were almost useless. Lisa listened to all of this with a growing sense of dread. She began to understand why the Zephyrians had reached out to humanity, why they had insisted on a direct diplomatic contact with someone from Earth. They were not looking for trade partners. They were looking for allies. They were looking for a species that had experience with war and conflict, that understood the brutal calculations of military strategy, that might be able to offer advice or assistance. But Lisa was a diplomat, not a military strategist, and she had no authority to commit Earth to anything. The United Nations had sent her with strict instructions to gather information and maintain peaceful relations. There was nothing in her briefing that had prepared her for this situation. As the sun set over the crystalline palace, painting the sky in shades of deep violet and gold, Arya took Lisa's hand and led her to a high tower. From there they could see the defensive installations, the weapons arrays, the shields that the Zephyrians had managed to construct, and in the distance, visible only to the most sensitive instruments, they could see the signs of the approaching Krillian fleet. Arya stood very still, her amber eyes fixed on the horizon, and Lisa could see the fear that the princess was struggling to contain. For all her grace and beauty and intelligence, Arya was still young, still facing a threat that was beyond anything she had ever experienced. She'd been raised to believe in the power of art and philosophy and dialogue, but none of those things could stop the machines that were coming toward her world. Lisa found herself reaching out and taking Arya's hand, offering a simple gesture of human comfort and solidarity. In that moment, something shifted between them. They were no longer just diplomat and princess. They were two women facing an impossible situation, and the connection between them became something real and genuine. That night, as Lisa lay in her quarters in the palace, she knew that her mission had changed. She was going to stay. She was going to help. And she was going to use everything she knew about human warfare and survival to try to save the Zephyrian people from the darkness that was coming toward them. It was a decision that would change everything, for her and for Arya and for the future of both their worlds. The war room of the Zephyrian palace was unlike anything Lisa had ever seen. The walls were made of living crystal that responded to the touch of trained operators, displaying holographic images of the star systems surrounding their world. Hundreds of Zephyrian military officials moved through the chamber, their faces etched with tension and worry. This was their command center, the heart of their defensive operations, and it was clear to Lisa that they were terrified about what was coming. Minister Thorne had arranged a full military briefing for Lisa early the next morning. He wanted her to understand the complete picture of their situation before she made any decisions about whether Earth might be willing to help. As Lisa studied the holographic displays, she began to grasp the true scale of the threat. The Krillian fleet approaching Zenith Prime consisted of 17 massive capital ships, each one kilometers long, covered in weapon systems and armor that had been developed over thousands of years of conquest. Supporting these capital ships were hundreds of smaller vessels, each one capable of independent operations. Against this overwhelming force, the Zephyrians could field perhaps 40 ships of their own, most of them designed for exploration and trade rather than warfare. The disparity was so vast that Lisa had to work hard to keep her expression neutral. Princess Arya entered the war room as Lisa was studying the displays, and Lisa could see the shadow of exhaustion in the younger woman's eyes. Arya had been awake all night, reviewing defensive preparations and trying to coordinate the evacuation of civilians from the outer settlements. She moved to stand beside Lisa, and Lisa noticed that several Zephyrian officers seemed to be watching the princess closely, waiting to see how she would react to Lisa's presence in such a sensitive location. Arya placed her hand on Lisa's shoulder, a gesture that was both reassuring and possessive. It was clear to everyone in the room that the princess had chosen to trust this human woman, and that choice carried weight. Minister Thorne began the briefing by explaining the history of the Krillians and the wars they had waged across this sector of space. He displayed records of their attacks on other worlds, showing the progression of their conquest. Planet after planet had fallen, each one reduced to a lifeless husk before the Krillians moved on to their next target. The weapons they employed ranged from conventional explosives to exotic energy weapons that could melt planetary surfaces and cause catastrophic geological instability. There was very little that the Zephyrians understood about the Krillian command structure or psychology, because the species was believed to be entirely automated, guided by artificial intelligence of a type far more advanced than anything currently known to exist. When Minister Thorne finished his presentation, he turned to Lisa and asked for her assessment. This was the moment that Lisa had been dreading. She was being asked to evaluate a military situation that was, by any reasonable assessment, completely hopeless. The Zephyrians were outgunned, outnumbered, and facing an enemy that had conquered 17 worlds before them. From a purely tactical standpoint, any human military strategist would recommend immediate evacuation and retreat. But Lisa looked at the faces of the Zephyrian officers around her, and she saw something that made her hesitate. She saw determination. She saw people who would rather stand and fight than abandon their world to the machines. She remembered why she had become a diplomat in the first place. It was because she believed that understanding and connection between different peoples could accomplish things that force and fear could not. But sometimes, understanding meant accepting that you had to help people fight for what they believed in. Lisa took a deep breath and began to speak. She explained the basic principles of military strategy, talking about terrain advantages and defensive positioning. She spoke about the difference between conventional warfare and asymmetrical conflict. She explained how smaller forces could sometimes defeat larger ones through superior knowledge and preparation, and by playing to their strengths, rather than engaging in direct confrontation. As she spoke, she could see the Zephyrian officers beginning to pay attention, beginning to imagine that perhaps there was a way forward that they had not considered before. Arya moved closer to Lisa, listening intently as the human woman outlined a completely different approach to warfare than anything the Zephyrians had tried before. When Lisa finished speaking, Minister Thorne stood up slowly. The minister's expression was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes that suggested he understood what was happening. The Zephyrians were about to transform themselves from a peaceful civilization into a warrior culture. They were going to ask their people to kill and to die in defense of their world, and they were going to ask a human woman to help them learn how to do it. Over the course of the next few days, Lisa worked with the Zephyrian military command to develop a comprehensive defensive strategy. She studied their ship designs and their weapon systems, their defensive capabilities and their limitations. She reviewed records of previous conflicts involving Krillian forces to look for patterns in how the machines attacked and where they might be vulnerable. Slowly, a strategy began to emerge. The Zephyrians had one advantage that no other civilization had possessed when facing the Krillians. They had living ships, vessels that could phase shift in and out of normal space for microseconds at a time. This technology had been designed for peaceful navigation through areas of space where normal travel was difficult or impossible. But in the hands of a tactical mind, it could be transformed into something revolutionary. Lisa proposed that the Zephyrians use their phase-shifting ability to appear and disappear unpredictably, striking at Krillian ships, and then vanishing before the enemy could respond. It was a strategy based on mobility and surprise rather than direct confrontation. It went against everything the Zephyrians had been taught about honorable combat, but it was their best chance at survival. Arya supported this strategy immediately, and her support convinced many of the other Zephyrian leaders who might have been hesitant. The princess understood that survival was more important than maintaining philosophical purity about how warfare should be conducted. As preparations began in earnest, Lisa found herself spending more and more time with Arya. The princess was intelligent and brave, but she was also deeply troubled by the moral implications of what they were about to do. One evening, as they stood on a balcony overlooking the city, Arya asked Lisa a question that cut to the heart of everything they were preparing for. How could she, Lisa, help a civilization prepare for war when warfare was something that humans excelled at, because they had been doing it for their entire history, while the Zephyrians had to learn it now, in the face of existential threat? Lisa thought carefully before answering. She explained that warfare was indeed part of human history, but so was the capacity to stand up against oppression and injustice. She told Arya that sometimes the most moral choice was to fight, even when the cost was high. And she told the princess that she was not helping the Zephyrians become warriors. She was helping them survive. As the first sensors began detecting the approach of the Krillian fleet, Lisa and Arya stood together in the war room, preparing for the battle that would determine the fate of their two worlds. The attack came exactly when Lisa had predicted it would come. The sensors on Zenith Prime detected the Krillian fleet emerging from faster-than-light travel on the outer edge of the system. The massive vessels began their approach toward the planet, their weapons charging as they moved. The alarms throughout the palace began to sound, a deep thrumming noise that seemed to vibrate through the very crystal of the building. Lisa stood in the war room watching the holographic displays as the enemy fleet moved closer and closer. Each of the capital ships was easily twice the size of the largest Zephyrian vessels, and they bristled with weapons arrays that dwarfed anything the defenders possessed. The smaller support vessels moved in formation around the capital ships, creating a layered defense that would make any direct assault suicidal. Arya stood beside Lisa, her amber eyes fixed on the displays, her silver skin seeming to pale slightly as she watched the overwhelming force approaching her world. But there was no fear in her voice when she spoke. There was only determination and a kind of terrible acceptance of what was about to happen. The princess had spent the last 3 days with the Zephyrian commanders, convincing them to accept Lisa's strategy, even though it violated every principle of honorable combat that their civilization had held sacred for thousands of years. She had told them that honor meant nothing if their world was destroyed and their people were annihilated. She had told them that survival sometimes required doing things that made you uncomfortable. Minister Thorne approached Lisa and Arya with a datapad displaying the final status reports from all of the Zephyrian defensive positions. The shields were charged to their maximum capacity. The weapons were loaded and ready. The evacuation of civilians from the outer settlements was complete. All that remained now was for the Zephyrians to decide whether they would stand and fight or attempt a desperate evacuation. Arya looked at Minister Thorne and then at Lisa. She took a deep breath and gave the order. The Zephyrian fleet would engage the Krillians using the strategy that Lisa had developed. They would use their phase-shifting ability to strike hard and fast, appearing and disappearing to confuse and disorient the enemy. They would aim for the weapons systems and the engines of the Krillian ships, trying to cripple them rather than destroy them outright. And they would not give up no matter how many ships they lost or how many warriors fell. The battle began with a terrifying display of firepower from the Krillian fleet. The massive capital ships opened fire on the planetary shields, sending waves of energy cascading across the protective barriers. The shields flared and held, but Lisa could see in the displays that they were degrading with each volley. The Zephyrian planetary defenses returned fire, but their weapons were designed for defense against conventional attacks, not against the overwhelming firepower of the Krillian armada. For the first few minutes of the battle, it seemed as though the Zephyrians were about to be overwhelmed. But then something changed. The Zephyrian ships began to appear and disappear with extraordinary precision, phasing in and out of normal space with perfect timing. They struck at the weapons arrays of the Krillian capital ships, and before the massive vessels could even track the source of the attack, the Zephyrian fighters had vanished again. The Krillian fleet seemed confused by this new type of warfare. Their targeting systems were designed for conventional enemies that stayed in one place and fought in predictable ways. Against opponents that could simply disappear from reality itself, the machines seemed unable to adapt their tactics quickly enough. One by one, the weapons systems on the Krillian capital ships began to go dark as the Zephyrian fighters struck with surgical precision. The defenses that Lisa had helped design were working. The strategy that had seemed so desperate only days ago was actually succeeding. But the victory came at a terrible cost. With each phase shift, there was a small chance that a Zephyrian ship would not successfully complete the transition back into normal space. 3 ships failed to rematerialize during the first hour of combat. The pilots and crews of those vessels simply ceased to exist, caught somewhere between dimensions. And even as the Zephyrian fleet scored hits against the Krillian armada, they were taking casualties. Enemy weapons that did manage to track their movements tore through Zephyrian ships, sending them crashing toward the planet below. Lisa watched each loss on the holographic display and felt a piece of her heart break with every ship that was destroyed. She had helped create this strategy, and every Zephyrian warrior who died was dying because of advice she had given. Arya seemed to be tracking the same thoughts. The princess gripped Lisa's hand tightly, and when Lisa looked at her, she could see tears beginning to form in those beautiful amber eyes. But Arya did not look away from the displays. She did not ask Lisa if this was worth the cost. She simply watched as her people fought and died to defend their world. 2 hours into the battle, the Krillian fleet began to pull back. The weapon systems on 3 of the capital ships had been completely destroyed. 2 others were limping with engines that were no longer capable of supporting the massive vessels. The smaller support craft were being destroyed at an alarming rate. The Krillians were retreating. The Zephyrians had actually done it. They had defeated an enemy that everyone had believed was unstoppable. But as the cheers began to rise throughout the war room, Lisa found herself unable to join in the celebration. She was looking at the casualty figures, and the numbers were almost unbearable. 23 Zephyrian ships destroyed or crippled, 741 Zephyrian warriors dead, hundreds more wounded and floating in the void waiting for rescue. Arya's hand was still gripping Lisa's, and when the princess finally turned to look at her, Lisa saw something in those amber eyes that would haunt her forever. It was gratitude mixed with an almost infinite sorrow. It was the look of someone who had just realized that sometimes winning came at a price that was almost impossible to bear. The princess pulled Lisa close and embraced her tightly, and as Lisa felt Arya's arms around her, she heard the princess whisper something that cut through all of the triumph and celebration. The princess was asking why they had to fight at all. Why could there not be another way? Why did so many have to die just so that a few could survive? Lisa did not have an answer to that question. She could only hold Arya and share in the terrible weight of what they had accomplished together. In the aftermath of the battle, the crystalline palace of Zenith Prime transformed into something between a hospital and a command center. Wounded Zephyrian warriors were brought in from the orbit, where their damaged ships had been collected by rescue teams. Medical personnel moved through the corridors with an urgency that suggested they were struggling to save more lives than they had resources to handle. Lisa found herself walking through these corridors in a kind of daze, watching the Zephyrians who had fought so bravely now, facing the consequences of their actions. Some of the injuries were catastrophic. Zephyrian physiology was not so different from human physiology in some fundamental ways, and Lisa found that she could understand the severity of the wounds even without complete medical knowledge. The warriors had suffered burns from weapon fire, decompression injuries from ships that had lost pressure, and the kind of trauma that came from exposure to the violent vacuum of space. But what struck Lisa most was the expressions on the faces of the wounded. There was no bitterness in their eyes, no regret or anger. Instead, there was a kind of quiet acceptance mixed with relief that they had survived it all. One of the first wounded warriors that Lisa encountered was a young male named Kyle. He had been piloting one of the phase-shifting fighters, and his ship had taken a direct hit to the starboard side during the final stages of the battle. The impact had sent him and his crew spiraling out of control. Kyle had managed to eject his crew in escape pods before his ship finally came apart, but not before suffering severe injuries to his left side. He was being treated in one of the palace medical chambers when Lisa found him. His skin, normally a shimmering silver, had darkened to a dull gray in the areas where his injuries were most severe. But when he saw Lisa, his amber eyes brightened with recognition. Kale reached out his right hand and Lisa moved closer to take it. The warrior's grip was strong despite his injuries, and he spoke in a voice that was surprisingly steady. He told Lisa that he wanted to thank her for helping the Zephyrians find a way to defend themselves. He told her that before she arrived, many of the younger warriors had believed that they would have no choice but to evacuate or surrender. But Lisa had given them hope and a strategy that had worked. Kale said that he was proud to have fought, and that he would gladly do it again if it meant protecting his world and his people. Lisa felt tears beginning to form in her eyes, and she struggled to find words that would be adequate to express what she was feeling. She told Kale that he had shown extraordinary courage, and that she was honored to have fought alongside the Zephyrian people. She told him to rest and to heal, and that she hoped he would make a full recovery. As she left Kale's chamber, Lisa realized that the weight she had been carrying since the end of the battle had not decreased at all. If anything, it had grown heavier. The Zephyrians were heroes. They had shown courage and determination in the face of overwhelming odds, but they had also paid a terrible price for that courage, and Lisa could not shake the feeling that she bore some responsibility for those losses. Arya found Lisa standing alone on one of the palace balconies watching the stars. The princess moved quietly to stand beside her, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. The battle was over, but it was clear that neither the Krillians nor the Zephyrians believed that the conflict had ended. The Krillian fleet was still in the outer system, regrouping and preparing for another assault. The Zephyrian defenses had proven more effective than anyone had anticipated, but the damage they had inflicted was not enough to destroy the enemy entirely. This war would continue, and both Lisa and Arya understood that there would be more battles and more loss before it was finally resolved. Arya reached out and took Lisa's hand, intertwining their fingers. When she spoke, her voice was soft and filled with emotion. The princess told Lisa that she had been reviewing the military records from the battle, and she had realized something important. The strategy that Lisa had developed was not just effective from a military standpoint. It was also merciful in its own way. By using surprise and precision strikes, they had minimized the number of Krillian ships that were destroyed. This meant that fewer Krillian warriors had been killed in the battle, and while Arya understood that the Krillians were machines and did not feel pain or fear the way biological beings did, she found herself unable to take pleasure in unnecessary destruction. Lisa looked at Arya with surprise. She had expected the princess to be triumphant after the victory, to be celebrating the success of the strategy they had developed together. Instead, Arya seemed troubled, as if winning had not brought her the satisfaction she had thought it would. Lisa explained to Arya that this was a natural response to violence, even when that violence was necessary and justified. She told the princess that humans often experience this same mixture of relief and sorrow after successful military operations. The taking of any life, even an automated one, carried with it a moral weight that could not be ignored or dismissed. Arya nodded slowly as if Lisa's words confirmed something that she had already begun to suspect. The princess told Lisa that she understood now why humans had so much experience with warfare. It was not because humans were naturally violent or aggressive. It was because humans understood something that the Zephyrians had never had to learn before. Humans understood that sometimes survival required difficult choices. Humans understood that protecting your world and your people sometimes meant doing things that violated your principles and forced you to question who you were and what you were willing to become. The princess suggested that they spend the next few days focusing on recovery and consolidation, rather than planning for the next phase of the war. They would tend to the wounded and honor the dead. They would rebuild the damaged ships and reinforce the defensive positions, and they would use this time to prepare themselves mentally and emotionally for the battles that were still to come. Lisa agreed with this approach, and together they turned away from the stars and returned to the palace to begin the work of healing and remembrance that would occupy them for the next several days. 3 weeks had passed since the first battle between the Zephyrian and Krillian forces. The palace had been transformed into a place of constant activity, with repairs being conducted on the damaged ships and new defensive installations being constructed across the planet. Lisa had barely slept during this entire period, spending most of her time in the war room analyzing the Krillian tactical patterns and trying to develop strategies for the next phase of the conflict. The initial victory over the Krillians had been followed by weeks of relative peace, but the sensors on Zenith Prime made it clear that this peace was only temporary. The Krillian fleet was still out there, damaged but not defeated, and every indication suggested that they were preparing for a larger and more coordinated assault. Minister Thorne approached Lisa one morning as she was reviewing tactical displays with a group of Zephyrian commanders. The minister looked exhausted, his normally bright eyes dimmed by fatigue and worry. He told Lisa that the Zephyrian government had received a transmission from the Krillian fleet. The message was brief and contained no negotiation or diplomatic overture. It simply stated that the Krillians would return to assault Zenith Prime again, and that this time, they would not accept any possibility of defeat. The message also included data about reinforcements that the Krillians were calling up from other parts of their operational zone. Within 2 months, the Zephyrian people would be facing a fleet that was nearly 3 times as large as the one they had just defeated. The numbers were staggering. Lisa listened to the estimate of enemy forces that would be arriving and felt her stomach tighten. Even with all of the improvements that the Zephyrians had made to their defenses, even with the tactical innovations that she had helped them develop, there was a limit to what they could accomplish against such overwhelming force. She looked around the war room at the faces of the Zephyrian commanders, and she saw the same realization beginning to dawn on them. They had won one battle, but the war was far from over. They were going to have to decide whether to continue fighting, or to attempt some kind of negotiation, or evacuation, before the Krillian reinforcements arrived. Arya entered the war room not long after Minister Thorne had delivered this news. The princess had spent the last 3 weeks visiting wounded warriors in the medical chambers and helping to oversee the evacuation of outer settlements. She looked thinner than before, and there was a weariness in her eyes that suggested she had been carrying an enormous weight for far longer than her relatively short life should have required her to bear. When Arya saw Lisa, something seemed to shift in her expression. The princess made her way to where Lisa was standing and took her hand without any concern for the watching commanders or for propriety. She pulled Lisa aside to a more private area of the war room, and once they were alone, Arya told her that she had made a decision. The princess explained that she had been thinking about what they could do about the coming reinforcements. She had consulted with advisors and military strategists, and she had come to a conclusion that many of them had been too afraid to voice. If the Zephyrians were going to survive, they would need help. They would need to reach out to other civilizations and ask for military assistance. They would need to form alliances and convince other worlds that the Krillian threat was not unique to Zenith Prime. The Krillians would eventually threaten every world in this sector of space, and the only way to stop them would be through coordinated resistance from multiple civilizations. Arya looked directly at Lisa and asked her a question that she had been asking herself for weeks. Would Earth be willing to help the Zephyrians fight against the Krillians? Would Lisa be willing to send a message to her own world and ask for military support? Lisa's initial response was one of hesitation. She explained to Arya that she was a diplomat, and that she had no authority to commit Earth to military action. She told the princess that such a decision would have to be made by the United Nations and by the governments of individual nations on Earth. It was not something that Lisa could decide on her own. But Arya was not dissuaded by this response. The princess told Lisa that she understood the constraints on human authority and decision-making processes, but she also knew that Lisa had credibility with her own government. If Lisa sent a message describing the situation on Zenith Prime and the threat posed by the Krillians, there was a reasonable chance that Earth would take the threat seriously. And if Earth sent even a small military force to support the Zephyrians, it might be enough to tip the balance in the coming battle. Over the next several days, Lisa composed a comprehensive report detailing everything she had learned about the Krillian threat and everything she had experienced on Zenith Prime. She included tactical analysis and predictions about how the Krillian forces would likely attack in the future. She explained that the Zephyrians were a peaceful civilization that was being forced to defend themselves against an enemy that gave them no choice but to fight or die, and she appealed to Earth's sense of justice and solidarity with other intelligent species to consider sending military support. When the message was finally ready to be transmitted, Lisa stood with Arya as it was uploaded into the communication systems. The message would take time to reach Earth and even longer for a response to come back. But for the first time since the initial battle, Lisa felt a small glimmer of hope. She had done what she could to convince her own world to take action. Now it was up to the leaders of Earth to decide whether they would answer this call for help. Arya embraced Lisa as they watched the data stream of the message being transmitted across the vast distances of space toward her home world. The princess told Lisa that no matter what happened, she wanted her to know that the Zephyrian people would always remember what she had done for them. They would remember that in a moment of crisis, a human woman had stood beside them and helped them fight for their survival. They would remember that Lisa had treated them not as aliens or strangers, but as people worth fighting for and worth dying for. And Arya would remember that in the darkest moment of her own life, she had found friendship and understanding and connection with someone from a world she had never even visited before. Together, the princess and the diplomat stood and watched the stars, knowing that whatever was coming next would test them both in ways they could not yet imagine. The future was uncertain, and the next battle would likely bring even more loss and suffering. But they would face it together, and that was something that neither of them would have thought possible just a few weeks ago.